are that you are joining this virtual forum that we shall begin in a few minutes. We're going to wait a few more minutes that other participants can join this Zoom meeting.
Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We will begin this virtual forum very briefly. We want to invite any of you. This conversation will take place in Spanish. If you need interpretation, please remember to click on the icon that is at the bottom of your screen that indicates interpretation, and then choose English so that you can listen to the interpreted conversation. Thank you for being here with us today. Vamos a empezar.
We shall begin. We welcome every one of you, and in particular, I want to give thanks to our panelists for this hour of his valuable time that he will spend with us for this virtual forum. This is the first of three meetings dedicated to understand and analyze the very particular and difficult situation facing El Salvador. During these three conversations, we will try to examine several elements that will allow an audience that is maybe not that familiar with the particularities of El Salvador to understand in a more comprehensive manner what is happening in that country and how we arrived to the current complex situation. In these three conversations, we decided to begin with what we felt is most important, the basis, and it's a focus on human rights. Of course, it is important to mention some elements of the context, which, without a doubt, Roberto will expand on them, which are fundamental. For those who don't have this on our radar, since March 2022, 3 years ago, the country has been living under a state of emergency, with a result, 85,000 people being detained without due process guarantees, suspended under the state of emergency. We are referencing, what we mean is that there is no court order. There's no possibility of filing a habeas corpus petition to question the reasons why they were detained. They have no right to communicate with their family or to receive personal visits, and they have no right to communicate with a lawyer. 85,000 people in a country the size and population of El Salvador. The repression has escalated to such a level that accusations are being fabricated against people who criticize the regime, journalists, lawyers, social leaders, and human rights defenders, simply for or for reporting. And what's being done in many of these cases is that illicit association is being added, so that people who are not linked at all with the gangs are also covered by the state of emergency without the rights to due process guarantees. Critical voices are being persecuted and imprisoned. In this context, with the arrival of the Trump administration to the United States, we saw was that the president of El Salvador sold they could send people are being deported to third countries and being sent to El Salvador. Slightly over 250 Venezuelan immigrants who in the United States were deported to Salvadoran prison. El Salvador is going to financial compensation for this exchange, at least according to what was publicly reported with the media outlets. So far, we have not seen the actual text of this international treaty to understand all the conditions, under what rights or under what conditions these people are being detained in El Salvador. This act is not only a violation of human rights, also highlights how the lines between immigration control and there's this mixture between jurisdiction in the migratory control and criminal law. All these lines are being blurred. We're seeing how easily a government labels a person as a member of a criminal gang without any proof, simply based on their appearance, simply if they have a specific or the type of clothing, they are labeled as such. And this leads to them being detained indefinitely, apparently. Paradoxically, the agreement with the United States once again brought the authoritarian and repressive system entrenched in El Salvador back into the spotlight. And there are more questions regarding this authority that has been consolidating in the country. This is why a dialogue like today's dialogue is urgent and necessary. Today, we have the pleasure and privilege of having Roberto Lopez with us, a panelist who will share with us the report on the state of human rights in El Salvador, and a link that we're going to share in the chat so that you can continue reviewing this resource. This is 2024 version of the report prepared from the Observatory of Human Rights from the José Simeón Cañas Central American University, an institution that does key work happening in the country and offers a rigorous and courage analysis. I want to highlight courageous analysis that is fundamental to the defense of the rule of law. Roberto Lopez, today's panelist, is the coordinator of the University Observatory of Human Rights at the University of Central America, UCA, in El Salvador. He's a sociologist and philosopher, professor and the Graduate School of Central American University. His main areas of interest include territorial dynamics and migration processes, critical thinking, citizen participation and democracy, public policy, and human rights. Roberto, thank you for being here with us today. The structure that we've thought up is that we're going to have a conversation with Roberto based on 3 questions, and then we want to receive questions from the public or from the audience. For this, I want to invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A section in the bottom part of your screen, which is right next to the interpretation function. And there, we ask you to add your questions to there, and we will try to address as many as possible in the final part of today's event. So without further ado, and we know that time is valuable, let's begin. Roberto, thank you for being here. It is a pleasure to say hi to you, everybody. Well, according to what appeared report that we've mentioned, what are the most frequent human rights violations and what are the worrying patterns that you have identified in El Salvador and concerns you the most? Well, first of all, cordial greetings from San Salvador, from the UCA campus. It is a pleasure to be here with you and sharing this work that we've been carrying out in the University Observatory of Human Rights in 2018, where we designed and we started working on this observatory. And starting in 2019, we've been preparing periodic reports to get to know the state of human rights in El Salvador. Back then, it was the pandemic which marked a lot of the work that we did. And then, just like you've highlighted, starting in 22, that accept that regime of state of emergency that has been working on the reports on human reports so we can be aware of what is happening in our country. With regards to the report, the annual report on human rights at the beginning of the year, I think that this report is a report that was has been worked on by the team of researchers in the observatory, solving or overcoming a series of difficulties to access information. And this, of course, gets us working on being and such as social media, monitoring the media outlets that we do every day, and also working on exchanging and consulting with the work done in the country as well as at the international level with regards to the human rights that we observe with our work. The work that we do in the observatory is focused on five human rights: the right to life, the right to personal freedom, the right to personal integrity, the right to access to justice, and the right to freedom of expression. We focus our rights because we also consider that those are crucial rights within this framework of the state of emergency, which is the right that's been most affected. Please say all of these rights have been affected the most, but of course, when we review the data and we review the information that we have, there are some that highlight more compared to others. For example, the right to personal freedom, the right to the right to access to justice, and the right to freedom of expression are the four of these five that highlight the most. And if you allow me to, I'm going to share this information that serves to characterize the state of human rights in El Salvador, but also to provide an idea of the behavior of the changes in this reality when it comes to the state of these human rights. First that we have to say is that this regime of state of emergency that has lasted more than 3 years, just like you mentioned previously, it's been in effect for over 3 years. It's a state of emergency that, of course, it's contemplated in the Constitution of the Republic, the application of a state of emergency, but the Constitution clearly establishes that this regime is established provided the country finds itself in a state of emergency and that the security of society is at risk. But besides this, it states that the state of exception is is a transitory measure, and it should not extend more than necessary. And it should only be applied while the state, first of all, takes control of the situation, but especially when the state defines a security policy that must be implemented in our society. And once those conditions occur, the state of emergency should no longer be applied. In other words, it should not be a permanent measure or that takes too much time. Instead, it should be while the state defines a public policy that's well designed and well implemented. starting from that point, we start having a problem with a state of emergency because of how long it did. It's been 39 months if we count from May of 2025. On the other hand, we should also mention that the state of emergency has deteriorated the social guarantees, the judicial guarantees, and the fundamental rights of the population. In our report, in our annual report, they mentioned over 85,000 people who have been arbitrarily detained. We have to update that number. As of May of 2025, it's over more than 85,000 people have been detained arbitrarily. On the other hand, we also have these that we're seeing that these detentions have raised the alarms in the jail system of our country because we've been seeing inhumane imprisonment conditions. There's a lack of medical attention. People, all these people are being detained, and unfortunately, reporting more deaths of people who are under the control of the state. Up to May of this year, there are over 400 people who have died who are being under the tutelage of the state when it comes to these people who have been detained under this state of emergency. Then there's another data that's important to take into consideration, and it's that many people, when they mention the state of emergency, they consider that it has helped to recover the public security in our country. And no doubt there are territories in our country that now people can move around with ease at any time of the day, but that does not mean that violence has disappeared entirely. And we've seen records of violence, sexual violence, gender-based violence, domestic violence, who have gone on the rise or have maintained the same levels as sexual violence. We have records of 468 incidents of sexual violence recorded in May of 2025. And on the other part, the system to access justice is something it's not complying or fulfilling its work so that people and citizens in general from El Salvador can feel protected and they can consider that within the justice system they can find a tool that protects them. On the contrary, the justice system generates many doubts with the work that it had to do when it comes to protecting people's human rights. And of course, there's strong restriction when it comes to freedom of expression and access. There's censorship, there's harassment to the work that journalists do and the work that human rights defenders also do. And when it comes to the portal of public data, it's no longer a reliable source for information. There are many setbacks when it comes to the right to life, and even the data reflects an important reduction in the number of homicides or murders. We have to observe those with caution because we've detected a sub-registry of data when it comes to mass burial sites that have been found throughout the country. These are not properly included within the number data of homicides or murders. On the other, also the way these homicides are accounted for, we also see problems in the state institutions because they don't count, for example, people who have passed away or died in face-off with security forces. They don't also count people who have died within or were included or detained in the jails of the country. And when it comes to access to information, they don't allow us to include data, for example, the gender of the victim, where the crime took place. All that type of data makes us to use that data with caution when they talk about a reduction in homicides because there's a sub-registry which could lead us to false or erroneous conclusions. And then we also have to talk about feminist sides, who's also gone on the rise. But there are a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to comparing the registries of the police authorities and the numbers that are counted by the social by civil society. There's a civil or there's a civil organization that the numbers that they take and compare it to the numbers that are counted by the authorities, it's a very, very low number. So that leads us to reach certain conclusions regarding this. When it comes to the right to personal freedom, it's to state that the forced disappearance show us that there's a very, very concerning reality. For 2024, the Public Prosecutor's Office for Human Rights, they report 11 cases of people who have disappeared, and it mentions the civil police as the institution who is responsible for these incidents. The arbitrary detentions is another important data because we have to take into consideration that in the case of El Salvador, up to 2025, we have a record of over 86,000 people who have been detained, as I mentioned previously. But of these 86,000 people who have been detained, we have data of 8,400 people who have been set free with substitute measures. It does not mean that they've been declared as innocent. Instead, they've been allowed to exit jail while their case is still under investigation, to the point where these people they leave under a legal condition as a social condition, which is very unfavorable to able to be reinserted into society or to the workplace. In 2024, the public prosecutor for human rights received hundreds of the announcements of people being detained arbitrarily, and some 83% of them are men, 17% are women, and they are all within the ages between 18 and 35 years old. I mentioned that we were really concerned about the jail system in the country, in the jail centers in the country. It is difficult to give precise data regarding this because the official statistics about people that are detained is still under reserve up to 2024. But based on historical data and projections that we've been carrying out, for 2025, we estimate that it'll be a jail population of over 113,000 people who are jailed, and with relation to the data of the population of the country's census, it indicates of 1,000 over almost 1,200 detained when it comes to every 100,000 citizens of the country. But now, when we talk about deportations of people from El Salvador and people also other El Salvador residents in Secot, Secot is has over only the case of Secot only has 37% of its total capacity. This, along with the data from the common jail system, the common jail system has its 320% of an excess of people who are currently jailed. There's a difference that is very noteworthy. What are they using Secot for? And what is the common jail system being used for in our country? That massive difference is very noteworthy, and that concerns us when we see how many people, the excess number of people are being currently. Then, when it comes to the right to personal integrity, there's a disproportionate use of force between January and March of 2025. The Public Prosecutor's Office for Human Rights received over 11 complaints in this sense, and the perpetrators, over 50% of them, are still the civil national police in this case. The General Prosecutor's Office, they show us data of people who have been affected, especially children, adolescents, and especially who is most affected are young people or young women in this case. When it comes to the right to justice, I want to provide some information, and we have to mention that it really concerns us. This really concerns us because there's a systemic weakening to the justice system of the country, and there's a collapse of the public defense system. When the public defense system, we have to say that up to September of 2024, the General Prosecutor's Office had 550 public defenders, but in December of 2024, now there were only 356 public defenders throughout the country. That means that the number of public defenders went down. And when it comes to how many of them are in the country, the public defenders unit in El Salvador, which is in charge of providing assistance to all these public proceedings, and especially with cases related to the state of emergency, it went from 232 defenders to 165, 30 plus percent reduction. This has to do with a decree that was applied in the country they where lawyers were and judges were left out of the system, where they met the retirement age and were asked to, or they had to initiate the retirement process, but they did not hire more people to maintain the capacity for the justice system. This is why we say that it has led to a collapse of the justice system, and especially in the case for the mechanisms of the public defender system. And this causes that the work of these public defenders is crucial. Every defender in the system has an average of 206 cases, and this is at least based on the data we have up to 2024. Processes, we have to say there's a severe restriction to the mechanisms for constitutional control. In 2024, we recorded over 350 processes for constitutional cases, where the majority were habeas corpus. Other were they were claims against the judicial, but only 50, 60 of them were admitted, and of these that were admitted, 29 of them were for habeas corpus, which we have to mention, and I think the clarification is important. You can present habeas corpus within the state of emergency. But look at this data. 29 habeas corpus that were admitted within the framework of the state of emergency in 2024, 28 of them were they decided that were not allowed to move forward. So people know that they can present the habeas corpus, but the chances of this moving forward are very, very low, at least in this case. Thus, we have a justice system that was just it's just a formality where at the end of the day they deny an effective implementation when it comes to cases such as forced disappearances or arbitrary detentions. And then when it comes to the right to the freedom of expression during 2024, this right was very restricted as a result of state policies and practices directed at controlling the public opinion and hiding information. It's a hostile environment for the independent journalists and for those who work on human rights. There's a criminalization and harassment for our work. And we have to mention that of the public space and the freedom of expression severely limits the possibility for the El Salvador population to receive information. I would say that in general terms, that's the environment or context that we're seeing in El Salvador. And of course, it's included the report of our work. And of course, we have to update that data, but the situation described there continues being equally concerning. compared to how it's been before.
Roberto, muchas gracias. Y gracias por
Roberto,
la
thank you very
aclaración en
much,
torno
and
al
thank you
habeas
for that
corpus. Sin
clarification
embargo,
regarding
es
habeas corpus.
impresionante, solamente 52
It's
recursos admitidos,
impressive that only 52 were,
perdón,
my
52
apologies,
presentados, 29
52
admitidos, 28
were presented, 29
improcedentes.
were allowed to
No es un recurso que
proceed, but
existe,
then only
¿no?
20 of them were shot down. So it exists.
Sí, sí,
En
sí.
la forma sí, pero en la práctica no.
The
Bueno,
yeah, in practice, it does not actually exist.
no todo el mundo
Well,
está
not
familiarizado
everybody
con
is
el
aware
régimen de
with this
excepción establecido en el
regime of state
2022.
of exception, which
Yo
was
creo que
established
es
in 2022.
interesante un
But I
poco
think
tratar de reflexionar y de
it's
entender cómo ha
important
respondido el
to
Estado de Derecho en El
see how
Salvador
the
frente a este régimen de
state of
excepción.
how
Yo
it's
siempre
responded to the state of
reflexiono en torno
exception.
a la
I
dificultad de
always
explicar
reflect
el
regarding
concepto de
to the
Estado de Derecho para
difficulty
la
of
población
explaining the
que
state
no
of
está
emergency
familiarizada con este
to the
término,
population who's not
entender cuál es el
aware of this
sistema
term, to
de
understand
controles, de
what
frenos, de pesos y
the
contrapesos que está establecido en el
control
régimen
system that is established
constitucional
in the
salvadoreño.
constitutional
¿Qué
state of
control
emergency in
tiene
El
la
Salvador,
declaratoria
what
de estado de
control is
excepción, cómo se
included in
verifican si
that
las condiciones
declaration
los
of
siguen
state of emergency,
justificando y
how do
si
they
cualquier
verify if the
medida se
conditions
puede dictar
warrant
bajo este
the
estado
state
de
of
excepción
emergency to
o no todo
continue,
es admisible
or if
bajo el
not
estado de
everything is
excepción. Entender un poquito esos
emergency.
elementos yo creo
To
que sería muy
understanding
valioso para
those
nuestra
elements is would be important for our
Claro,
audience.
por supuesto.
Of course, yes.
Veamos, el régimen de excepción, como
The
dije, está
regime
contemplado en
of the
nuestra
state of
Constitución
emergency is
y puede
included in our
ser
constitution,
solicitado
and it could
así
be
por el presidente de
requested
la
or
República
solicited
o así
by the president of
considera
the republic
que la situación
when
del
they
país
consider that
es tan grave
the situation in the
y convenga que
country
se
is
tomen, en
that
el caso de casos
serious, and
urgentes,
that the
que
measures
solicitarlo.
to be
Pero
applied
eso no es automático,
urgent,
es
that it
decir,
has to be applied,
debe
but this is not
pedir a la
automatic.
Asamblea
They
Legislativa
have to
que
ask
estudie
the
el caso, que
legislative
analice la
branch
situación,
to
que haga
study
las
the case,
consultas
to analyze the
necesarias
situation,
y es la
to
Asamblea
make the
Legislativa
necessary
la que debe,
consultations,
digamos,
and the legislative
dar
branch is the
su
one
autorización
that
para
should
que se aplique
provide
el
the
régimen de excepción,
authorization to
porque
apply
su
the state of
aplicación implica
emergency, because
que
its
algunos derechos
application
dejen de ser,
implies that
digamos,
some rights
considerados
are no
temporalmente,
longer
como el derecho de
considered
asociación, el derecho de
or taken into
reunión,
consideration.
el
For
derecho
example,
de tener, digamos, una
to
defensa
meet with other people in
pública,
public, or the right to have a
etcétera,
public defender,
derecho a la
etc.,
comunicación
the
con
right
familiares de las
to
personas detenidas, el
communicate
derecho a un
with
debido
those that
proceso,
are relatives who
¿verdad?
are detained.
En general,
As a matter of
y se
fact,
miran
we've had
restringidos en este
some
caso.
delays. We've
Pero por
seen
esto es
some
que yo
restrictions in this case.
enfatizaba
This
el
is
régimen de
why I
excepción
placed
establecido en
emphasis
la
that
Constitución
the
es
state of
un régimen
emergency
transitorio
established in the
que no debe
Constitution is
alargarse
a
más allá
transitory
de lo
measure
debido.
and it should not be
Eso es
applied further
importante,
than
claro. Dicho
necessary. That's
así, queda como
important.
muy,
Having
digamos, como
said
muy
that,
abierto para
it's
que
left open
el
so
presidente, la
that
Asamblea
if the
Legislativa
president or the
consideren
legislative
no haber
branch
sido
consider
suficientes
that
las condiciones
the
pueda
conditions have not been
seguirse
overcome,
aprobando,
they
renovando
can
cada
continue
mes
approving
y,
or renewing every single month
y se aplica
because
por un
they
mes
apply it
en este
for
caso.
1 month at a time in this case.
El problema que tenemos en El
The
Salvador
problem that we have
es
in El
que
Salvador
también
is
existe el
that
sistema de justicia
there's also the
que se verá
justice, we also
afectado
have the
en ese
justice
sentido,
system
ya que
is being
debe
affected by the state of
litigarse, digamos
exception
así,
or
en
state of
las
emergency.
condiciones que este régimen
It has
establezca.
to work or
En
move
el caso
forward
de El
based on
Salvador,
the conditions of the state of
tenemos
emergency. In
una
the case of El
presidencia que
Salvador, we
tiene
have a
toda la
executive
verificación
branch that has the
un
legislative
sistema
branch
judicial
completely in its
con
favor, and
jueces
a justice
nombrados
system
por
with
esta misma,
judges
digamos,
named by this
que
very
está
the
aprobada.
same
Por lo
legislative
tanto,
branch
tenemos aquí un
working under
problema
the orders of the
de muy
executive branch.
bajo
So we
nivel de
have a
autonomía,
problem with
digamos,
a
con
very,
estos
very
órganos
load
del
of
Estado que
autonomy with
están
this
prácticamente
branches of the
trabajando a
government
favor de las
working
decisiones
in
y de
favor
las
or for the
peticiones o
decisions
exigencias que
or
en algún momento
requests or
debe plantear el
demands
Ejecutivo
proposed
por
by
medio de
the
la
executive
presidencia
branch
de la República.
via
Eso es lo que
the
nos ha generado
presidency of the
cierto
republic.
problema en
This has
nuestra labor
generated a
de vigilancia
problem
de derechos
for our
humanos,
work
porque
and
no
when it comes to
encontramos
supervise human rights, because
institucionalidad en el
we
Estado
don't find
que primero
any
que nos escuche,
institutionality in the state that
luego
first of all would
que
hear us
entienda
out and
la
then
gravedad de lo que estamos tratando
understand
de mostrar
the
como
severity that we're
indicadores
trying
de
to show
violaciones de
with
los
this
derechos humanos
data
y
when it comes to
luego
violations of human
que
rights, and
si el
to
régimen
also
de excepción fuera
understand
aplicado
that if the
para
state of
recuperar,
emergency was
digamos, la
applied
tranquilidad o recuperar
the
ciertos
peace
niveles,
or
digamos, de seguridad
recover
en
certain
algunos
degrees of
territorios,
security
ya
throughout the territory,
y
And on the other hand, we have governmental advertising saying that El Salvador is much safer than before. And they even say that El Salvador is the safest country, not only in Latin America, but the entire world. We see a contradiction in the public discourse. Is it a safe country or not? And if it is it necessary to continue with a state of emergency that existed for more than 3 years? The conclusion that we reached is that the state of emergency is currently being used as an advertising resource or a resource to maintain the level of popularity of the government or the president himself, and it has been distancing itself more and more from its origin, which was that the population could be able to move around with much more freedom or security throughout the, which is relative because the population acknowledges that they can move around throughout the territory at day and night, but it's a very, very supervised movement. It's a very controlled movement by the, especially by the police and the armed forces, who are the ones that are permanently supervising what's happening in other territories. It's security that's based on fear, based on threats, because these arbitrary detentions, when we review the patterns that have led to these arbitrary detentions, they have been because somebody, whether it was an anonymous phone call, and they said, "Hey, in my neighborhood, in the block where I live, there's a group of young people that who I think are suspicious." That is enough so that the security forces arrive and take these people away without further explanations. They are applied under the state of emergency, and from that moment on, they no longer have or access to a public defender, and the due process is not followed. And don't know exactly where the person is being detained, or difficult to carry out the work of supervising, making sure that human rights are being respected. It's part of the pattern that has also been happening. The civil national police and the armed, when they are moving around the territory, that arise, that see that they have any tattoos. It doesn't matter. A tattoo of a rock band, a specific clothing brand that they to have on their body. They simply consider that because they have a tattoo, they're suspicious enough, and they are taken away under the state of emergency. That is, that is what has made it so difficult for us to and to ensure there is protection for these people. And what's more, the state of emergency has started being applied to limit or difficult or silence the critical voices, those who oppose the government. And we've seen in the where Alejandro Enriquez, who was linked to the case, who was a lawyer, who was accompanying the community, was asking for help to not lose their. He is detained and he's accused of participating in public acts and protests that place public security. And then we have the case of Ruth Lopez, who is also well known, who has been working for, and of course is also a lawyer. And in the case who are also academics, these are professors in academia that we cannot forget. Academia is a.
Gracias, Roberto. Yo creo que eso
Thank
es
you,
verdad.
Roberto. What you mentioned is very, very true. We have to highlight that how it's also the right to education and the freedom of silencing critical voices in all.
Bueno, la tercera pregunta que teníamos
The
que abrir al público,
question
si quiere
before
empezar a
we
traer
open the floor,
las preguntas
I
que
want
ustedes
to
nos están
and we also see the questions that you are sharing with us,
¿por
is
qué es importante
why
conocer
is it
e involucrarse con la
to
situación de derechos
understand
humanos en
and
El
get involved
Salvador?
in
¿Qué pueden
Salvador?
hacer las personas
What can
salvadoreñas y
people
no
do in El
salvadoreñas
Salvador, whether
desde el
they're
exterior?
residents or
Y quiero
citizens,
agregar
or
una
they
pregunta
can do it
justamente
also
aquí que
out?
tenemos del público,
What
que
can
tiene
they
que ver
what can they do? And I want to mention
¿qué le
from the
pedirían
audience, what would
parte de
you
la sociedad
ask
salvadoreña a la comunidad
the
internacional,
El Salvador
a
society,
las
to the
embajadas,
international
a los
community, to the
consulados, a la
embassies, the
cooperación, a
consulates,
los
to
gobiernos,
international
para
relations, to
no
the
repetir la
governments,
omisión y
to not
complicidad que están
and
cometiendo
complicity
contra el
that they are
régimen de
committed
Ortega
to
en
the
Nicaragua.
Nicaragua dictatorship.
Muy bien. Bueno, voy a tratar de
Very well
responder a estas preguntas que son muy
to answer
importantes
these
sobre
questions,
los
which
derechos
are
humanos.
very,
¿Ya? Yo diría que
I would
es
say that
importante tomar
it's
conciencia de lo que está pasando en
aware of
términos
what's
de
happening when it
derechos
comes
humanos
to
en
human
nuestro país
rights in our country
por dos razones
for
fundamentales.
two
La
fundamental
primera
reasons. The first
es
one
que
is
eh,
that
desde la firma de los acuerdos de paz en El Salvador se dio
these
inicio
were
a un
signed in El
proceso de
Salvador, we
democratización de la
initiated a
sociedad
process of
salvadoreña. Lo digo en esos
reestablishing
términos
democracy
porque no es que
in our
alcanzamos la
society. And I
democracia en el
mentioned this
país,
because we didn't
pero que sí
reach
habíamos dado
full
avances
democracy in the
importantes
country, but we
en
had
términos
made
de
significant
institucionalidad, en
progress when it
términos de
comes to
protección a los derechos humanos
institutionality, when
y
it
en
comes to
términos de
protecting
una
human
mayor
rights,
una
and when it
participación
came to
ciudadana más
greater
visible,
citizen
mejor informada
participation
y sobre todo
or
más
informed,
progresiva.
and especially
Eso me parece a mí que es
feel
importante no
that
perderlo
this
de
is
vista
important to not lose
porque
track
con
of
lo que
this,
está
because
sucediendo en
with
la
what
actualidad en nuestro país,
currently in our
estamos
country, we
perdiendo
are
mucho de lo que
losing
habíamos
a lot of
avanzado en ese sentido. ¿Ya?
sense.
Y
And
aunque no hemos perdido
even if
plenamente
we
todo
haven't
esto,
accomplished
pero
all of this,
estamos
but we
retrocediendo en
are
muchos aspectos.
taking steps backward.
No debemos permitir, primero,
But
ni el
not
retroceso
allow,
y
not
tampoco
first
debemos permitir perder
backwards,
totalmente
and we cannot allow
la
to
esperanza de la
lose all
democracia.
hope for democracy.
Y luego hay que tener en cuenta que no
We
hay
have to take into
democracia sin derechos
consideration
humanos.
that there is no,
Eso no hay que
we
ponerlo en duda.
cannot, we
Democracia y
always,
derechos humanos, digamos, son un
democracy and
socio
human rights are a
indiscutible,
combination
¿ya?
that is
Indiscutible.
indisputable.
Pero por otra parte,
But
también es importante
it's
tomar
also important
conciencia de esta
to be
información, de
aware
estos datos,
of
de esta
this
situación,
issue, of this
porque
data,
estamos
this
hablando
situation,
de
because we're talking about
personas que están siendo
people
víctimas
that are
de este
being
régimen
of
y
this
que
regime,
estas
and that
personas necesitan de
people,
nuestra voz,
they need to hear our
necesitan de nuestro
voices,
trabajo
they need to
para que su
hear our
situación
work,
no
so that
quede en
their
el olvido
situation
y que
is not
además
forgotten,
se
and
les
that
pueda
besides this,
dar
they
acceso a
can
la justicia
have access to
siguiendo el debido
justice
proceso en este
during
caso.
the due process.
Y como digo,
And
estamos hablando
as
de
I
un régimen
mentioned,
de
in
excepción
the
de más de 86
state of
mil personas
emergency, where over
detenidas de forma arbitraria,
86,000 people have been
más de 8
detained
mil refugiados,
arbitrarily, and
pero que
over
esas
8,000
medidas sustitutivas están sufriendo
have
el estigma de haber estado
substitution,
detenidas y que siguen
and they are no
siendo
longer within a
personas
jail. They are
bajo
still
sospecha
people
según
who
el
are
Estado
under the
y eso
according to the
dificulta
state.
mucho su
This makes
reinserción
it very difficult to
en la
be
vida de la sociedad.
into
Entonces, en nombre de los
society or
víctimas,
into
es
formal
importante
employment. So, on
tomar
behalf of these
conciencia de lo
victims,
que está
it's
pasando,
important to be
de lo que está pasando en
aware
nuestro
of.
país. Y por otra parte,
And
yo
also,
quiero decir
I want to
que
say that
el trabajo que debemos hacer
the
en
work
términos de
that we
derechos
have to do
humanos
when it comes
aquí en nuestro país
to our
nos,
country,
nos,
it
nos pide
asks
un
us,
trabajo
it asks
muy
us
cuidadoso,
to do
muy
very
cauteloso, muy
cautious,
fino
careful
de
work, very
recoger
fine-tuned
información,
work
para
to
recoger
collect
testimonios,
information, to
para
collect
escribir nuestros informes.
testimonies,
Esto es
and
un
to
informe que
prepare our
presentamos
reports. These
a este
reports that we
observatorio, pero también
present
otras organizaciones del
observatory
país
and with
también han
other
presentado
organizations in
y
the
se van
country
construyendo
who are
muy
also
cuidadosamente
presenting,
porque
being
sabemos el riesgo
prepared
y lo
very,
delicado
very
que es
carefully
esta
because
información. Y entonces eso nos
information
lleva a
is.
organizarnos
So
muy bien,
this
a revisar
this
cuidadosamente
leads
nuestro
us
trabajo
to
y
get
sobre
organized
todo
really well,
a ir construyendo una red
by
interna, una
preparing
red nacional de trabajo que
for
nos permita el
national
intercambio de
work
información, pero también nos
to
permite
exchange information, but
animarnos a hacer esta
to
labor
to
que está
continue
siendo
doing
complicada
this
y que
work
está siendo
that's
muy,
being
muy
complicated,
sacrificada, ¿no? Una
and
labor de mucho riesgo, pero que
it's
este
a very
ritmo de
risky
trabajo,
work.
de
But for this
constructivo, de trabajo
as a
trabajo
network, this collaboration that we're
sabes, pues
doing more
articulado
organized.
es una labor importante y vamos a seguir
It's a very
profundizando
important
en
work,
ese
and we're going
sentido
to
con el
continue
cuidado,
working in
por
that
supuesto,
sense with the
que hay
necessary
que
care
poner
that we
en
have
el
to
tema de
use
este trabajo.
in throughout all
También
this
este
work.
trabajo
But this
nacional
work
debe también encontrar la forma
must
de
also
articular
find a way
con
to
redes internacionales que nos puedan ayudar en ese
networks
sentido.
that can
¿Y
help
cómo
us
nos
in that
pueden ayudar
sense.
esas redes
And
internacionales?
how can these
Bueno, nos
international,
pueden ayudar
well, they can help us to
primero dándole seguimiento a este trabajo, que nuestros informes, cuando le lleguen a sus
reports
manos, también
when
nos
they
puedan
reach
difundir esta
your hands,
información entre
to
sus redes allá
share
en
this
sus
information
países
with your networks
y
in
por
your
otra parte,
countries,
que además
and
de tener conciencia de lo que está pasando y de
to be
ayudarnos en la
aware
difusión de nuestra información,
when it comes to
también
sharing our
vayan
information,
encontrando la manera de
and then
articularse y de ejercer, digamos, algún
to
tipo de
exercise
influencia
some type of
sobre sus
advocacy
gobiernos y sobre
with
las
your advocacy,
organizaciones
with your
y
work
también
and your
con nuestro
organization,
trabajo de cooperación en nuestros
have
países
work
para que también se
cooperation, work
sumen
with our countries
a
so
nuestro
they can
llamado de
join
atención y se sumen a nuestra denuncia.
and to
La
join
historia de
our
nuestro
formal
país nos lo confirma.
of our country
Cuando
confirms this.
estábamos en los años de la guerra civil salvadoreña
During Salvador
y
Civil War,
comenzó a hablar
and we
ya
began
se
to
comenzó a
work
hablar de
on,
negociación,
we're talking about
aquello
healing
arrancó con
process.
muchas
This
dificultades
began with many
y
difficulties,
comenzó
and it
a trabajar en
began
ese
to
sentido,
work in
pero
that.
las dificultades
But
nunca
the difficulties
desaparecieron después de las
never
dificultades.
disappeared.
Y
There
fue
were always
precisamente
difficulties,
la
and this was
participación de la comunidad
precisely the
internacional,
participation
por
from
supuesto la
international,
participación de Naciones Unidas, pero también
participation from
de
the
los
United
países amigos
Nations.
del
But of
secretario
course,
general entonces, ¿no?
the countries
Recordemos
were
pues, cuatro países,
then,
México,
remember those
Venezuela,
four countries, Mexico,
Colombia,
Venezuela, Colombia,
España, también participaron en esto.
also participated in
Esa
this.
presión internacional
That
sirvió para
international
que ese
pressure
proceso
helped
se
so that the
mantuviera a
process
flote y
could
fuera dando frutos.
stay afloat
La
and
implementación de los
bear
acuerdos de
results,
paz
or
también requirió
the people
de la presencia activa
required the
ya y
active
propositiva
presence
de la
and the
comunidad
pro-positive
internacional y
work
eso permitió
presence
que no
from the
se cayera la
community. And
implementación
this
tan
made it
rápidamente.
possible so that the
Pues ahora
implementation did not
también
go
requerimos de ese
quickly.
tipo
We
participación
now
de la comunidad
require
internacional,
that
ya no
type
solamente
of
como
participation from
espectadores
the
y solamente
international
como
community,
sumándose a lo
not
que
only
nosotros
as
hacemos,
spectators,
sino
but also
también encontrando
joining
una
and
manera de
joining
construir
our efforts
propuestas y de
to
construir,
find ways for
digamos,
them to create proposals and
mecanismos de
to create
incidencia
some
sobre quienes
advocacy
tienen la
mechanism
posibilidad de ser
for those
escuchados
possibly to
en nuestro
be
país.
heard in our country.
Gracias, Roberto.
Thank
Vamos a ir
you,
trayendo
Roberto.
unas preguntas
We're
del
going
público que estamos recibiendo
to
de diferentes
respond
fuentes.
some
Quiero
questions
empezar
that
con
we're
una última
receiving
que yo
from
creo
the
que se conecta
audience.
aquí
I
muy
want to
bien para
begin
mantener la
with the
conversación
last one,
y es,
linked to
te
what you just
preguntan si
mentioned,
podrías hablar si hay
to ask
elementos
if you
dentro de
can
la
speak
policía o el
about if
ejército que
elements
no
within the
están de acuerdo con
police
el
or armed
régimen de
forces
excepción
who
y
do
con
not
el rol que
agree with the
ellos
state of emergency
están jugando
and
dentro de
the
ese
role
régimen,
that they have to
si
play
ahí
within the
habría,
regime,
como
if
digamos,
there would
alguna
be any
posibilidad de
possibility
desobediencia
to
civil,
civil
o incluso
disobedience,
otras
or
situaciones
also any
más
other
desafiantes para el país.
more challenging situation for the country. And he's on mute, right?
Estás en silencio.
You're on mute right now.
Perdón, sí,
My
perdón.
apologies.
No, es una
Yes, yes.
pregunta muy
It's
interesante,
a
aunque no fácil de
thing
responder,
question, even if
porque
it's not
no tenemos
easy.
acceso a
We don't
información
have
en esos
access
campos.
to the
Sin
information.
embargo, hay que destacar que si hay un
However, we
movimiento
have to
dentro de la
highlight
Policía Nacional
that there is
Civil
a
que se ha declarado, digamos, crítico
police
a
that has
las
been
políticas de seguridad pública que se están
very
implementando
critical
y
to the
sobre todo al
public
manejo
policies being
crítico de cómo
implemented,
se están manejando los recursos que el
the
Estado salvadoreño
resources
tiene
that the state
destinados
resources are
a
being
la
used
seguridad
and in
pública
theory are
en El Salvador.
directed for
Este
public
movimiento, sobre
security.
todo,
This
ahora no
movement
recuerdo el
in
nombre, pero
particular,
se
I don't
puede
remember the
rastrear, por
name of it,
supuesto,
but if
en
you
redes
can
sociales, este
be,
movimiento de la Policía Nacional Civil, que surgió muy
which
crítico a
it
cómo se
was, it
estaba
became very
manejando los primeros
with
meses de la
regards to
implementación.
how
Y
the
fueron
first months of
precisamente
the
quienes
regime
lo
were being
tomaron en
handled,
cuenta
and they were the
cuando
first
dijeron
ones who
que el régimen de excepción
raised the
no
alarms by
exigía
saying that the state of
a la Policía Nacional
emergency
Civil cuotas
ended,
diarias de
that the
detenciones
public police had daily
y
quotas
que
for
estas cuotas diarias de
detentions, and that
detenciones
these
fue lo que
daily
llevó a
detention
que muchos
quotas,
jóvenes
which
que
led to
iban
people who
de su centro de
were
estudios hacia su casa fueran detenidos.
education
O de los
center
que simplemente habían salido de su
going
casa
from
a
school to their
comprar
home, or
un
people that
refresco
sit
en la tienda,
home to
¿ya?
buy
Y que en el camino,
a soft drink
lastimosamente, se encontraron con una unidad
at a
de la
local
policía o
store.
una unidad del
They
ejército y
or
se
ran
los detuvo.
into a local
Jóvenes
police
que
armed
iban de su
force, and they were
trabajo
detained.
hacia
For
su
people
casa
who
o de su
were
casa
going
hacia su
from the
trabajo,
workplace to
pues
home
fueron
or home to
detenidos.
the workplace,
Cuando
they were
comenzamos a
also
documentar ese
detained.
tipo de
When we started
detenciones,
to talk
a los que no les
of
encontramos ningún
detentions
sentido
where
ni
we
ninguna
found no
explicación,
sense or an
entonces fue que
explanation,
conectamos con estos
this is where
hermanos de la Policía
we
Nacional
were
Civil que decían, el problema
to
es
the
que
national
hay una
police,
cuota
and they
de
said that
detenciones que
the
se están
issue or
pidiendo
the problem is that
a
this
la policía
quota
y al
is
ejército en
being
el marco del régimen de
demanded
excepción. Luego, este movimiento se
within
ha
the
mantenido
framework of the
crítico
state of
precisamente
emergency.
para denunciar
This movement has
excesos de
stayed
trabajo o
critical,
excesos de tiempo de trabajo y para denunciar
denounce
también el
excess
mal
work
uso de los
or
recursos que se está haciendo en términos
resources
de seguridad pública.
in the sense that they were
Además,
supposed to be
también denunciaban que
for
muchos de
public
los
security,
policías
and
a
many of the
quienes
police
se les
are
pidió que se retiraran porque
saying
avanzaban
that
su edad de retiro
they
y se
they
les
were forced to
ofreció un
retire because
reconocimiento
unfortunately
económico por eso,
reached
no se les
the
entregó el reconocimiento
and they were going
económico
to give
en su
an economic
totalidad como se le había ofrecido. Entonces,
recognition,
hay
and they
este
haven't
movimiento
received it, or they haven't
que
received it in
actúa
its
con mucha
entirety.
cautela y con mucho cuidado,
That
porque
movement does
claro, siguen
exist, but
estando
it
o
moves
siguen siendo parte
with a lot of
de la institución
cautious
policial y que
because
ponen en
they're
riesgo
still
el
part of the
trabajo, ponen
police.
en riesgo
So
incluso
their
su seguridad dentro de
job
institución.
and their
¿Ya?
security in the
De la Fuerza Armada es mucho más difícil dar una
institution
opinión porque
when
es
it
una
comes to the
institución
armed,
mucho más cerrada, ¿ya?
more
Y
difficult to give an
también mucho
opinion
más
because it's a
difícil
most
que pueda salir, digamos. No se
closed or
conoce
more
hasta ahora
private
públicamente
institution
de algún movimiento dentro de la Fuerza
aware
Armada
of any
que esté
movement
siendo
in the
crítico en ese sentido.
armed forces that they feel or denounce what's happening with the government.
Gracias.
Thank
Muchas
you,
gracias, Roberto. Creo
Roberto.
que
Thank you very much.
es
I think
interesante pensar en
it's
esas voces
interesting
críticas
to think about those
dentro de las
critical
instituciones.
voices. With
Nos hacen otra pregunta que tiene
we
que
have
ver
another
sobre la
question that
necesidad
has to
del
do with
régimen de
the
excepción.
need
Si ya han habido los suficientes
of
cambios,
exception.
considerando el
If there
número de
have been
personas
enough
que
changes,
supuestamente
take
eran
into
peligrosas
consideration the number of people who are
y están
supposed to be
siendo privadas
dangerous
de
and they are
libertad,
already
si
jailed
se
or
discute algo de la
detained.
necesariedad de
Is there any
continuar bajo ese
discussion
régimen o
about the
esa
need to
conversación y
continue
esa
with the
reflexión
state
que
of
hacías al
emergency?
comienzo no
Or
hace
is
parte
that
del debate público?
conversation or discussion, is
Vamos
it not
a ver,
part
si
of
es
public
parte del
discourse?
debate público
Yes, it's
entre
part of the
académicos y
debate
entre
or
organizaciones de la
discourse
sociedad
between
civil que
academics
vean
and
con
civil society
preocupación
organizations
los
who
resultados que está
see
teniendo el
these
régimen de
results
excepción en
with a
términos
lot
de
of
derechos
concern.
humanos. Ese
When it
debate se
comes
mantiene
to
abierto y lo
human rights,
seguimos haciendo
this debate
con
is
toda la
open
intensidad
and
que la
we
situación nacional nos lo
maintain it
permite.
with all the necessity
Pero
allowed to us.
lastimosamente
But
es un debate
unfortunately,
al que,
it's
por
a debate
supuesto,
that, of
invitamos
course,
a
we,
representantes del gobierno
the
a que participen,
government
pero
representatives, to
no nos
participate,
responden.
but
Ya encontramos con las puertas cerradas o
respond.
las ventanas
We find
cerradas
their
que no
door
puede,
those
digamos, la
closed
figura
to
creada
us,
sirva para entender
depending on the
que
figure that
el
we
gobierno es
use, helps us
hermético
better
en su
understand that the
gobierno
government is
cuando,
hermetic in this.
cuando
And
decretan una
when they
renovación más del régimen de
when there's a
excepción en la
decree
Asamblea
for
Legislativa,
a yet
¿ya?
another
Y
renewal of
entendemos
the
que
state
se
of
han hecho
emergency in
consultas,
the
pero las han
legislative
hecho
branch,
nada más
we
en otros
understand
grupos
that
afines de
consultations
oficiales
have
del
been made
gobierno, ¿ya?
in
Que
circles of the
les
government
dan datos
where
para
they
justificar el
are
régimen de
provided
excepción en
data
términos de que la
which
sociedad sigue necesitando esta medida, porque
so
aún
that they
hay
can claim that the
elementos
society
de
needs
las
it to
pandillas, desde las maras todavía
because
ahí
there are still some gang members
circulando,
there
hay
and
denuncias todavía de la
moving
población
free,
que no se han
and there's
revelado todavía, ¿ya?
some
Y eso lo ocupan para
who
justificar
have
el
yet
régimen de
to
excepción.
be attended to
Sin embargo, como digo,
justifies continuing
nosotros
with the state of emergency.
nos,
However,
nos
what
preocupa no
concerns
es
us
si hay delincuentes o
not
no
if there are any
detenidos. Si están
criminals, if
detenidos, por
they're
supuesto que hay que
detained or not.
aplicarles la
If
justicia si son delincuentes. Si se ha hecho
they
una
have to
investigación
be
debida,
submitted to
si
justice,
se ha seguido el debido
if
proceso y se
we have to
comprueba
make sure
que han
that due
cometido
process has
delitos,
been
por
followed
supuesto
and
que
they
deben estar
prove that they
detenidos.
have committed
Eso no
crimes,
tenemos duda.
they have to
Lo que nos
be in
preocupa
jail.
es este
That does
grupo de
not
personas que
it's
siguen
this group of
detenidas,
people
a
who are
quienes no se les
still
ha
detained,
comprobado
who they
ningún
have
delito
not
ni ninguna
no
pertenencia
crime
y
has been
que
proven
llevan
against them,
mucho tiempo
and they've
detenidos
been
y que sus
detained for
proyectos
a
de
long,
vida se han
and
visto
that their life
seriamente
projects
afectados.
have been serious.
Quizás valdría la pena compartirles
Might be worth
posteriormente
to
otro
share
informe
with
especial que
you
preparamos el año pasado
the
que
report
se
that we
llama Vidas
prepared last
Interrumpidas,
year,
que
which is
preguntamos
called
precisamente por estas
Interrupted
personas
Lives,
que han
which
sido detenidas y que
people who have been detained
medidas sustitutivas
and
porque no encuentran la manera
they were allowed
de
to leave the
recuperar
jail
sus
on
vidas
parole.
después de que
They've
fueron
yet to
sueltos.
find
No
a way to
encuentran
find
trabajo,
to recover their life.
no
They can't
encuentran posibilidades de seguir
find
estudiando
any work.
y
They
están
cannot continue with
reconsiderando
their studies,
seriamente
and they are
emigrar.
seriously
¿Ya?
considering
De hecho, ya han
leaving
migrado
again.
internamente
As they've
porque no
already
podían seguir
internally
viviendo
migrated
en sus
because
barrios, en
they
sus
couldn't
colonias,
continue
por el
living
estigma
in
social con el que
neighborhoods
salen.
because of the social stigma.
Luego, no encuentran trabajo, no encuentran empleo, no
They don't
encuentran
find job,
oportunidades
they
de
don't find
desarrollo
employment, they don't
por
find
el mismo estigma con el que han salido.
opportunities to
Y
continue
entonces,
with their
¿cómo se va a
studies because of the same
vivir sobre
stigma.
la vida
So
cotidiana en
they've
cualquier país?
considered leaving
Eso
the
es
country
dañar
because
los
they
proyectos de
find no
vida de
reason
esas
to continue.
personas, que creo que también es muy grave.
The way
Y
they've
es
damaged
precisamente
the
por
life
esta
project of
relación
the
que
people.
consideramos
That's very
la
serious.
excepción no
So this
debiera
is
de
why
ser
these
y que en su
victims
lugar
of the
lo que deberíamos de
emergency,
tener
this
es una
is why it should
política
not
de
continue. And
seguridad
instead,
pública
we
bien
should have a
desplegada,
public
bien
security
diseñada
policy
y
that's
bien
well
implementada.
formulated,
Pero
well
eso
designed, and
todavía
well
carecemos en
implemented.
este país.
But that's still what we're lacking up to now.
Y esto me lleva a la siguiente
And then
pregunta.
my
Estamos
next
hablando de
question,
personas,
we're
muchas
talking
de ellas que
about
fueron injustamente
people
privadas
that
de la
many of
libertad.
them who
Sin
are
embargo, tratas
unfairly
de hacer
detained
referencia al estigma que las acompaña una vez
reference the stigma that
quedan en
accompanies them
libertad.
once
Yo quería preguntarte
once
por la
they
opinión
exit
de
the
la
jail.
ciudadanía frente a
So,
estas
what
violaciones
is
de
the
derechos
opinion of
humanos. ¿Por qué están tolerando,
violations of human rights?
apoyando
Why are they
esta situación? ¿Y cuál es la reflexión
supporting
que
this
ustedes hacen como
situation?
defensores de
And what is
derechos
the
humanos
reflection that you
en
make
torno a
as
dónde está
human
la opinión
rights
pública
defenders
respaldada?
with regard
Sí, muy importante
in
esa
El
pregunta.
Salvador?
Muy
Yes, this question
importante
is
porque
very important
nosotros que
because
hemos hablado con estas
we
personas y
who
que
have
hemos hablado
spoken
con
with
sus
these people
familiares,
and we've
ya
spoken with their
tenemos muy claro
relatives,
que han
we
sido
are
víctimas de
very
un
clear
régimen,
that they've been
¿ya?
victims
Y
of a
que
regime,
las
and
seguimos considerando víctimas
we still
de
consider
este
them as
régimen.
victims of this
Y
regime.
procuramos
And we try
hacer
to ensure
pública esa situación,
to
procuramos
make the
dar a
situation
conocer
public.
esa realidad
We
lo más
make this
posible
reality
con los
known as
recursos que tenemos. Pero
resources
aquí
that
hay
we
que tomar en
have.
cuenta
But
que nos
here we
podemos
have to take into
competir
consideration
contra
that we have to
una
compete with
estrategia de
a
comunicación y de
an,
publicidad
a
gubernamental que
communication
es
and
enorme.
advertising strategy
¿Ya?
from the government that
El
is
Estado salvadoreño
huge. The
destina
El
una buena cantidad de sus
Salvador
recursos
government
a
sets
esa
aside
estrategia de comunicación y de publicidad en
resources
todos los
for
medios
these
posibles,
communication and
radio, televisión
advertising
e internet.
strategies
Y es
on internet,
difícil trabajar contra
social
eso.
media,
¿Y cuál es el problema de todo esto?
radio,
Que como
television.
dije,
What's the
estas
problem with
personas
all of this
salieron
is that these
bajo medidas
people,
sustitutivas,
they
es
are out
decir,
on
no
parole.
han
In
sido
other
declaradas
words, they have
inocentes.
not been
Y
declared
por tanto el
innocent.
Estado las
Thus,
presenta
the state
como
presents them
personas
as
sospechosas,
people, as
¿ya?
suspicious people,
No como personas inocentes.
not as innocent.
Somos nosotros que insistimos
We
que
are the
son
ones
víctimas,
who insist
pero el Estado no
victims,
dice que son
but the
víctimas.
state does not say that they are
Estas personas
victims.
siguen
These
siendo
people
sospechosas
are
y están en
still
investigación,
suspicious and they are
¿ya?
under
Y entonces la
investigation.
población que recibe
So
toda esa
the
información
population that
por parte del Estado,
receives
pues sigue
this
confundida.
information,
A ver, ¿son víctimas o
well,
siguen
are they
siendo,
victims
digamos,
or are they
sospechosas,
still
¿ya?
suspicious
De haber
people,
cometido
of
delitos,
suspicious of having
¿ya?
committed a crime?
Entonces, ese es un
So
problema muy grave
that is a
que
very
estas
serious
personas
problem,
deben,
and
digamos, enfrentar,
these
que sus
people, a
familias,
problem that these
que
people and their
tendrán
relatives
los
have to
costos de
face
todo
as
esto
well, because at
sobre
the
sus
end of the
vidas, porque el Estado no cuenta
are
con una
assumed by
política
the
y con
families
un programa,
because this
¿ya?
a
Para que
policy
estas
or a
personas
program so that
reciban
these
algún tipo de
people can
atención médica,
receive any
algún
type of
tipo de atención
medical attention,
psicológica,
any type of
algún tipo
psychological
digamos, de
attention,
atención que les permita
of
reinsertarse
attention
en
that
la
allows
vida
them to be
económica y productiva del país. El
reinserted in
Estado
the
simplemente
economic
los
and
deja
productive
salir
system of the
y
country.
no les
The
da
state
ningún tipo de
allows
apoyo.
them to
Son sus
leave jail,
familias que tienen que asumir
but without
esto.
any type of support. It's the family that has to take on it.
Gracias, Roberto. Quiero terminar
Thank
brevemente con la
you,
última
Roberto.
pregunta
I want
porque
to
me
finalize
parece
with
que no la
the
podemos dejar afuera.
last question.
Y la pregunta es
Ignored. The question
si
is,
en tu opinión la
in
UCA
your opinion,
es uno
is
de los
the
objetivos de la ley sobre agentes
for the
extranjeros que se
government
implementa a
applied
través de
the
la legislación?
foreign agent?
Muchísimas gracias por esa pregunta.
Thank you very much
La
for
ley de
that
agentes
question.
extranjeros es
The
una ley,
Foreign
en primer
Agents
lugar,
Act
que
is a
veíamos
law that,
hasta
first
cierto
of
punto
all, it
innecesaria.
was to a certain
Primero
degree
porque
unnecessary
la ley establece que
because
todas las
the
organizaciones no
law
gubernamentales
establishes that
que trabajan en el
all
país
NGOs that
deben registrarse,
must
¿ya?
be registered
Para poder seguir
in order
desempeñándose. Ese registro ya
to
existía.
continue carrying out
No
its
hay una
activities.
organización
That already existed,
no gubernamental en el país que haya
NGO in the
podido
country
hacer su
that
trabajo
has been
sin
able
antes haberse
to do its
registrado
work
en el Ministerio del Interior.
without
Ese
being
registro ya existía.
in the Ministry
En
of
segundo
Interior.
lugar, La
In
ley
second place,
establece que las organizaciones
establishes
deben
that the
declarar sus
organizations
ingresos
must
y pagar
declare
impuestos.
their
Eso
income
ya se
and pay
hacía,
taxes. That
ya se
is
venía
already
haciendo.
being done.
En realidad, la
In
ley lo
reality,
que está buscando es otra
what the
cosa,
law is
es
seeking is
tener
something
mayor
else.
control
It's
sobre el trabajo que
greater
hacen las
control
organizaciones
over the
no
work done
gubernamentales y,
by
por
these
supuesto,
NGOs, and
quitarles
of
un poco más
course,
de los recursos, de
to
los pocos
take
recursos que
away
tenía, ¿ya?
some of the
Quitarles
little
todos esos
resources they
recursos
had,
para que el
to
Estado
take
pueda
away
hacer el
those little
trabajo que le
resources
corresponde hacer,
so that the government
que
that
es la política social, ¿verdad?
do,
Para
which
su
is social
población.
policy
Entonces,
for
la ley nos
segregation.
parece que
So
lleva otro
we feel that
tipo de
the law
intencionalidad, y
has
eso que
another
no lo dice
intention, another
expresamente la
purpose,
ley,
even
pero
if
nosotros
it's not
concluimos
explicitly
a
said in
partir de
its
esta
law,
situación que
but
hemos
our
señalado.
conclusion comes
Si la
from
banca
these
entra o
issues
no
that I
entra
mentioned right
en
now.
esa categoría,
Is the
que tiene la ley,
included
pues en
within the
principio no
categories
debería,
of
porque
this
somos una
law? In
institución de
principle,
educación superior,
because
no
we're a higher
una organización no
education
gubernamental,
institute, we're
propiamente
not
tal.
an
El
NGO.
problema con la ley
The problem
es
with the
que
law
la
is that
calificación que hace la deja
though
muy
the
abierta
it's
y
very
prácticamente
open for
deja
its
a criterio de
categorization
quienes
and it
implementen
leaves
la
it to
ley
the criteria of
para
those
quién
who implement
aplica.
the law
¿Ya?
regarding
Y
who is
entonces
included and who
eso,
is not
al
included.
quedar tan abierta y tan
So
difusa
being left
la
so open,
caracterización de quienes
so
entran,
vague regarding who
corremos
is
el riesgo
included,
de que en algún
we run
momento
the risk that at
encuentren por
any
ahí
moment
algún
they might
artículo o
find
encuentren
any
por ahí
article
algún tipo de
or any
actividad que hace la
type of
universidad
activity done
para
by the
poder meterla
university
dentro de esta
to
ley.
be
Porque
able
hay que
to
decir
include it
que la
within the
ley
law, because we have
prohíbe
to
a las
say that
organizaciones
this law
cualquier tipo de acción
forbids
que
that
sea
these type of
considerada política.
organizations does
¿Ya?
any type of
Que pueda
activity
ser
that's
considerada
considered
como una política
political or a
que ponga en riesgo la
that
seguridad del
puts
país.
the country's
Entonces,
security at risk.
es
So
esa manera de plantearlo
the
en
way
la
it's
ley la
proposed
que,
in
digamos,
the
deja
law
abierto el riesgo
leaves it
de que al
open for the
final
risk
esta
that at the
universidad
end of
pudiera
the
entrar
day, university
pueda
can
ser
be
aplicada
included,
sobre la
or the
universidad. No
law could be
debería,
applied.
como digo,
It shouldn't,
pero
as I mentioned, but
eso queda a criterio de quienes lo
that is
aplican.
left to the criteria of who implements it.
Muchas gracias, Roberto.
Thank
Sí,
you
nos
very
están
much,
agradeciendo porque
Roberto.
creo
I'm
que
aware
esta
of time
conversación podría
because I
continuar.
feel that
Creo
this
que hemos quedado
conversation
muy
could
interesados
continue.
en el tema.
We've
Nosotros
left
vamos
with
a
a
enviar un
lot of
estado de
interest
seguimiento en
with
todos
this
los
topic. We're going to
participantes,
provide a follow-up email to
incluyendo
all
tanto el informe al
participants,
cual hicimos referencia hoy
including
como otras
the report that
interrupciones del
we
régimen de
referenced,
derecho
as
y la
well as
ruptura de los
Interrupted
proyectos de
Lives,
vida,
the
porque
state of
nos parece
emergency,
que este
and
es
the
un tema
project of
vital
interrupted lives. We
que
feel this is
amerita
a
una
a
conversación y
vital
capaz que
topic that
podamos
warrants
volver
a
a tener a
separate
la Uca aquí
conversation.
con nosotros para
Maybe we
hablar
can have
justamente
Uka
de
here on
este
a
tema
separate
y
occasion to
también
talk
vamos a
about this
incluir
topic, but
los
we're also going
vínculos
to
a este
include
seminario
the
virtual que van a
links to this
encontrar
virtual
en
seminar
la
that we're
cuenta de
going
YouTube de
to
Alianza
include in
América.
the
Y lo vamos
YouTube
a hacer
channel
porque
for Alianza
queremos
Americas. Why are we
invitarlos
going
a
to
que
do it?
compartan esta
Because
información
we're
con
inviting you
otras
to
personas
share
que
this
no pudieron
information
estar
with
el
other
día de
people
hoy
who could
con
not be here
nosotros.
today with us,
Entender la complejidad de los
to
desafíos en El
understand the
Salvador es
complexity of
fundamental
the
para
challenges
transformar
in
la
El
situación
Salvador is
y, como
fundamental
Roberto
to
bien lo dijo,
change
el
the
apoyo y la
situation.
acción
And
de
just like
todos y cada
Roberto
uno de
mentioned,
nosotros
the
es
support from
importante
each
para
and every
cambiar
one
esta
of us
narrativa
is
que
to
le está haciendo
change this
muchísimo daño al
narrative that is
país y que es
causing
lo que
a
está
lot of
permitiendo
damage
que el
to the
régimen se
country,
mantenga hasta la
allowing the
revocación.
regime to continue
Queremos
doing what it's
acompañar,
doing.
agradecerles a todos
We want
ustedes
to
por
also
este
give
espacio de
thanks to
reflexión y de
all of
discusión
you
colectiva
for this, for your
y
participation.
especialmente queremos agradecerle a
Especially, we
Roberto
want to
López por
thank
su
Roberto
participación el
Lopez
día de
for
hoy,
his
por su
participation today,
valentía y por
for
su
his
claridad.
courage,
Realmente
and
es
for
un
his
honor y
clarity. It
agradecemos
is
mucho
truly an
tu
honor,
tiempo, Roberto.
and we give thanks for your time,
Muchas
Por
Roberto.
favor,
gracias a
recuerden.
ustedes.
Thank you very
Gracias.
much. Thank
Recuerden
you.
que lo que está ocurriendo en
Please,
El Salvador no puede
happening
verse
in
como un fenómeno
Salvador
aislado. Eso no
cannot
está
be seen
ocurriendo
as
ahí.
an
El
isolated incident.
debilitamiento del Estado de Derecho, la
There,
criminalización de la
the
disidencia
criminal
y el uso del aparato
and the
social para
use
reprimir
of
voces
this
incómodas
status
son
to
señales que
silence the comfort of
debieran
voices,
alarmarnos a
signs
todos y
that
no
should
están
alarm
solo
each and every
ocurriendo.
one of us. And they're
Estas
not only
conversaciones
happening
no
there.
solo documentan lo que
These
está
conversations
ocurriendo, sino
not
nos
only
ofrecen
document what
una
is happening,
herramienta para
they
comprender, para
also offers a
resistir y
tool
para
to
actuar.
understand,
Desde la
resist, and
sociedad
act.
civil, los
As
medios,
civil
la
society,
academia y
the
la
media,
ciudadanía,
academia,
tenemos
and
la
citizens,
responsabilidad,
we
como
have a
dije, de amplificar estas
responsibility
voces,
to
de
amplify
exigir
these
rendición de
voices,
cuentas
demand
y de
accountability,
sostener la mirada sobre lo
to
que se quiere
shed
ocultar.
light on what they
Les
want to hide.
invitamos a que
We
continúen
invite you to
participando
continue
en nuestros dos siguientes foros. Aquí
forums in
estaremos
this
a la
series.
misma hora el
We
día
shall
12 de
be
junio para
tomorrow hour
por
on
qué se
June
instauró el
11th
régimen de excepción.
to
Hubo varias
discuss
preguntas
why
interesantes.
was a
Esas
regime
vamos a profundizar más
established,
en él.
we're going
Y
to
el
focus
18
more on
de
this,
junio
and on
para
June
entender cuál
18th
es el
to
impacto
understand
en
what
la
is the
narrativa oficial
impact
en la
on the
opinión pública.
official narrative on
Esperamos
public opinion.
encontrarlos, pueden
We
encontrar
hope
toda
to
la
see
información de
you there.
registro en nuestras redes
All the
sociales.
registration
Muchas
information on our
gracias,
social media.
continuemos atentos,
Thank you very
informados,
much. Let's
conectados.
remain
La
vigilant,
solidaridad y
informed,
la
and
demanda
connect.
informada son hoy
Solidarity
más
and informed
necesarias que
reporting
nunca.
are more
Muchísimas
necessary
gracias a
today than
todos, que
ever.
tengan
Thank you very
muy
much,
buena noche.
everybody.
Hasta luego.
Great rest of the day. Goodbye.